Wichita Massacre. On a freezing December night in 2000, a young woman walked more than a mile through the snow, barely clothed, to bang on a stranger's door. She was the only survivor of one of the most brutal crimes in Kansas history, and her courage in those frozen minutes would be the reason her attackers were ever caught. The crimes were the work of two brothers, Reginald and Jonathan Carr, who arrived in Wichita with long criminal records and, over a single week in December of 2000, embarked on a spree that left 5 people lost and others wounded. It is remembered today as the Wichita Horror, and it remains one of the most appealed capital cases in American history. How did the spree unfold? It began with a robbery in which the brothers forced a young man at gunpoint to withdraw cash from a series of machines, and continued days later when they fatally wounded a 55-year-old cellist and librarian, Ann Walenta, as she tried to flee in her car. She lost her life to her injuries weeks later. Each act grew bolder than the last, a city slowly realizing that something terrible was moving through its streets. But the central horror came on a December night, when the brothers forced their way into a home where 5 young friends were spending the evening together. What happened in that house? Over several hours, the 4 men and 1 woman inside were robbed, terrorized, and subjected to a prolonged and degrading ordeal, then driven to a remote soccer complex on the edge of the city. The details of what they endured are among the most disturbing in any American case, and they are best left unspoken. There, all 5 were fatally wounded and left in the freezing night, after which the brothers drove a vehicle over the scene in an effort to ensure no one survived. 4 of them, Brad Haka, Heather Muller, Aaron Sonder, and Jason Befort, did not survive. They had been ordinary young people, friends gathered on a winter evening, with no connection to the men who forced their way in. How did anyone get out alive? One young woman, known publicly for years only as Holly, survived because a small hair clip deflected the round meant to end her life. Despite catastrophic injury and the bitter cold, she walked over a mile to find help, gave descriptions of the brothers, and became the prosecution's central witness. Her identity was protected at trial, and it later emerged that she went on to marry the man the brothers had robbed at the very start of their spree. What happened to the Carrs? Captured within days, the brothers were convicted in 2002 on dozens of counts each, including capital homicide, and both received capital sentences. For the survivors and the victims' families, that should have been the end. Instead, it was the beginning of a legal saga that has now run for more than 2 decades. Why has the case dragged on so long? In 2014, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned the brothers' sentences. But in 2016, the United States Supreme Court reinstated them in a near-unanimous ruling, written by Justice Antonin Scalia in one of his final opinions. The Kansas Supreme Court affirmed the sentences yet again on remand in 2022, and lower courts denied further motions in 2024. Where does it stand now? In late January of 2026, the Kansas Supreme Court heard fresh oral arguments, with defense lawyers arguing that confusion over how counts were numbered between the 2 phases of the trial had invalidated the sentences, and the district attorney dismissing the dispute as mere semantics. As of mid-2026, the court had not yet ruled, and both brothers remain incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility. Kansas, notably, has not carried out an execution since 1965. And so, a quarter-century on, 5 families still wait for a final word that never seems to come. The Wichita Horror unfolded over a single, brutal week. The next case stretched its cruelty across nearly a month, in a flat decorated, of all things, with cartoon cats. The Hello Kitty murder. A teenage girl walked into a Hong Kong police station in the spring of 1999, tormented by nightmares of a headless ghost that would not let her sleep. What she eventually led officers to would become one of the most horrifying cases the city had ever recorded. and it would take its strange name from the cartoon decorations that filled the flat where it happened. The victim was Fan Man Yi, a young woman of 23 who had endured a desperately hard life. Abandoned as a child, raised in an orphanage, and pushed onto the streets as a teenager, she had struggled with addiction and was working at a nightclub when she crossed the wrong people. It was a small debt that sealed her fate. What set it in motion? Fan had taken a relatively small sum of money from a triad member named Chan Man Lok, who then demanded far more in return than she could ever hope to repay. It was, in the end, a trivial debt, the kind that should have been forgotten in a week. Instead, in the brutal logic of the world Fan had been forced into, it became a justification for something monstrous. In March of 1999, Chan, 2 other men, and Chan's teenage girlfriend abducted Fan and imprisoned her in a flat on Granville Road, a building that, by grim coincidence, was filled with cheerful cartoon cat decorations. What followed was not a swift crime, but a slow and deliberate one, carried out over weeks while the outside world had no idea she was missing. What happened in that flat? For roughly 4 weeks, Fan was held captive and subjected to relentless, sustained cruelty at the hands of her captors until she finally lost her life. The full extent of what was done to her during those weeks is among the most appalling on record, and it does not need to be recounted here. Afterward, her captors concealed her remains, hiding part of them inside a large Hello Kitty doll, the detail that would give the case its haunting nickname. How was it discovered? The crime came to light only because Chan's teenage girlfriend, who had been present during the ordeal and was haunted by what she had witnessed, walked into a police station weeks later. Officers, at first unsure whether to believe her, followed her to the flat, where they recovered the hidden remains, including the skull sealed inside the doll. Without that one young witness breaking down under the weight of her nightmares, Fan might simply have vanished, another forgotten woman the city had never looked out for, with no one ever knowing what had become of her. Why were the men not convicted of homicide? Because so little of Fan's body could be recovered, the prosecution could not establish a precise cause, and the defense argued she had passed away from an overdose during her captivity. As a result, in 2000, the 3 men were convicted not of homicide, but of manslaughter, and each was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge described the case as involving a level of cruelty and depravity unlike anything Hong Kong had heard of in recent memory. Where does it stand now? 2 of the men, Chan Man Lok and Lung Wai Lun, remain in prison serving life sentences. The third, Lung Xing Cho, had his sentence reduced on appeal and was released after about 14 years. Fan's skull was eventually returned to her family and cremated, and the building where she was held was later demolished and replaced by a hotel, where small memorials are quietly kept. The case left such a deep mark on Hong Kong that it inspired films and shaped the city's true crime memory for a generation. Fan Man Yi was failed by almost everyone in her short life, and in losing it, she became a name the city could never quite forget. Remembered painfully, not for who she was, but for the cartoon doll that hid what was done to her. In the Hello Kitty case, there was no doubt a terrible crime had taken place. The next is the opposite, a loss ruled an accident, though many remain certain it was anything but. Phoebe Hansjuk. Concierge in a luxury Melbourne high-rise made a grim discovery one December night in 2010 at the very bottom of a 12-story garbage chute. How a healthy young woman came to be there has never been settled, and the official answer has satisfied almost no one who has looked closely at the case. Phoebe Hansjuk was 24, a former receptionist who was a keen climber and martial artist, living in an apartment in a luxury complex with her older partner, Anthony Hampel, the son of a prominent retired judge. The relationship was reportedly turbulent, and Phoebe struggled with anxiety and with alcohol. On the night she lost her life, those struggles and the unanswered questions around them would collide. What did the evidence show? Phoebe had been drinking heavily, and toxicology later found a sleeping medication in her system that had been prescribed not to her, but to Hampel. Forensic findings indicated she had survived the fall down the chute briefly before her injuries proved fatal. There was a further wrinkle that troubled the family. Police had classified the case as self-inflicted within days, before forensic testing was even complete. And Phoebe, an experienced climber and martial artist, was hardly the sort of person whose body simply failed her, which made the idea that she had drunkenly hauled herself into an overhead chute all the harder to accept. It was how she came to be in that chute at all that would become the heart of the dispute. Why is the case so contested? The chute hatch sat about a meter above the floor and was spring-loaded, meaning that entering it required deliberately lifting oneself upward into it. Investigators found no fingerprints on the chute or its hatch. No injuries to Phoebe's fingers consistent with hauling herself in. And the hatch appeared to have been wiped clean. There were also reports of bruising on her arms, of broken glass and blood in the apartment, and that her partner had eaten dinner and had a drink at the apartment after noticing the broken glass, before calling police. The coroner's own assisting counsel suggested an open finding was warranted, given everything that did not add up. What did the coroner decide? In December of 2014, after a contested inquest, the coroner ruled the case an accident, concluding that Phoebe had climbed into the chute herself while in a confused state caused by alcohol and the sleeping medication. Critics, including the family's lawyer and a major newspaper investigation, called the finding speculative, pointing out that the medication is documented to cause routine sleepwalking, like walking or driving, but not extraordinary feats, like hauling oneself into an overhead chute. The ruling, in other words, asked people to believe in a sequence of events that no one had ever recorded happening before. Did anything change because of the case? It did. The case helped prompt a review of how coronial findings can be challenged in the state. And in 2018, new laws were passed clarifying the appeal process for the coroner's court. It was a reform born of one family's refusal to accept the answer they had been given. There was also a chilling later footnote. Some years on, another young woman who had been in a relationship with Hampel was found lifeless at her family home hours after the couple broke up, in a case ruled self-inflicted but disputed by her family. No connection between the two has ever been established. But for those following Phoebe's story, the echo was impossible to ignore. Where does it stand now? Anthony Hampel was never charged with any offense relating to Phoebe's passing, and the case remains officially ruled an accident, with no further inquest or charges pending. Phoebe's family continues to campaign publicly, and the case was the subject of a major investigative podcast that re-examined every disputed detail. To this day, two utterly different stories sit side by side: an official account of a tragic accident, and a family's conviction that the truth was never properly pursued. Phoebe's case turned on a single disputed ruling. The next case involves at least a dozen in a different century, and a culprit who was never caught. The Torso murders. The man who had helped bring down Al Capone met his match in Cleveland, in the form of a predator who left a trail of bodies through the city's poorest district and was never identified. Nearly 90 years later, the case remains one of America's great unsolved mysteries, though modern science has only just begun to chip away at it. Between 1935 and 1938, an unknown predator took the lives of at least 12 people in Cleveland, leaving their remains in and around the impoverished ravine known as Kingsbury Run, near a rough district of bars, gambling dens, and homeless camps. The crimes were marked by a chilling brutality and a disturbing precision, and the victims, many of them drawn from the area's flophouses and transient camps, were people the city had largely overlooked even in life. That, perhaps, is part of why so few were ever identified, and why the case has lingered as a wound in the city's history. Who were the victims? Of the 12 recognized victims, 7 men and 5 women. Only 3 were ever identified at the time. Many of the bodies had been treated with a chemical preservative and drained, leaving the remains in an unnatural, leathery state that deepened the horror. As for investigators, in a desperate bid to put names to the rest, authorities even displayed a reconstruction of one unidentified victim, the so-called tattooed man, at a major public exposition in 1936, where more than 100,000 people viewed it. And still, no one recognized him. That a person could be so thoroughly erased, even with such a distinctive set of tattoos, said something bleak about who the victims had been and how little the wider world had known them. What was Eliot Ness's role? Cleveland's famous safety director, Eliot Ness, fresh from his triumphs in Chicago, took a personal interest in the case. In 1938, frustrated by the lack of progress, Ness led a controversial raid on the shantytowns of Kingsbury Run, rounding up dozens of men and burning the shacks to the ground. The raid was widely condemned, but strangely, the killings stopped. Were there suspects? There were 2 main ones. The first was a troubled surgeon, a war veteran who had performed amputations in the field, lived in the area, struggled with alcohol, and reportedly failed multiple early lie detector tests. Ness privately believed he was the one responsible, but he was never charged and spent much of the rest of his life in a veterans' hospital, reportedly sending Ness taunting postcards for years. The second was a bricklayer who confessed under questioning, then recanted, claiming he had been beaten, and who was later found lifeless in his cell in an apparent self-inflicted manner that an autopsy, revealing broken ribs sustained in custody, cast serious doubt upon. Was the bricklayer ever cleared? Yes. Decades later, after careful historical research, a marker was placed on his grave, posthumously clearing him of any involvement in the killings. A small act of justice many felt was long overdue. Where does it stand now? The case remains officially unsolved. But in 2024, the county medical examiner partnered with a genetic genealogy group to exhume some of the unidentified victims from a potter's field, beginning with the tattooed man. As of the most recent updates in late 2025, that testing was still underway, and no victims had yet been identified. One of the enduring puzzles is that the killings simply stopped after Ness's raid, as if the person responsible had moved on, been institutionalized, or passed away, leaving no further trace. The case has continued to grip the public imagination, inspiring books, comics, and screen adaptations. But the central question endures. Who was the figure who haunted Kingsbury Run? And why did the bodies suddenly cease to appear? After nearly a century, the people the perpetrator discarded may finally be given back their names, even if the man himself is now beyond any reckoning. The Cleveland Predator was never named. The next case is far more recent, and the mystery is not the identity of a culprit, but whether a passing the authorities called an accident was something far darker. The Tamla Horsford case. A mother of 5 went to an adult slumber party in a Georgia subdivision one November night in 2018, the only black guest among the group. By the next morning, she was found lifeless in the backyard, and what really happened that night has divided a community and a country ever since. Tamla Horsford was 40 years old, a beloved mother from Forsyth County, Georgia, a place with a long and painful history of racial exclusion, where black residents had been violently driven out generations earlier, and few had lived for most of the 20th century. She arrived late in the evening at a so-called football mom party, the only black guest among the group. And the next morning, she was found face down in the yard. That history, and the fact that she was the lone black woman in the house, would hang over everything that followed. What turned a private tragedy into a national controversy was how the investigation that came next was handled. What did the authorities conclude? The state medical examiner ruled the passing accidental, attributing it to multiple blunt force injuries consistent with a fall from a balcony, combined with a high level of alcohol in her system. Toxicology also found a prescription anti-anxiety drug for which Horsford had no prescription. On that basis, the sheriff's office closed the case as an accident within months. Why did so many people refuse to accept that? Because of how the scene was handled and a glaring conflict of interest. The scene was not preserved as a possible homicide scene. Guests left before all could be interviewed, and unusually few photographs were taken. One guest's partner, who placed the emergency call, worked for the county court system and was later fired for accessing the case files from his work computer. And he was reportedly personally friendly with the lead investigator. To the family and to a watching public, it looked less like a neutral inquiry than like a circle of people who already knew one another closing ranks. Did a second opinion change anything? A second autopsy commissioned by the family documented additional cuts to her face, wrist, hands, and lower legs, along with an injury to her heart, that the family argued were inconsistent with a simple fall. There was also the question of the anti-anxiety drug in her system, which one guest later acknowledged sharing with friends at the party, though she said she had not given any to Horsford. The competing findings and the unexplained injuries deepened the suspicion that something had been missed or deliberately overlooked in the rush to close the case. Was the case reopened? It was. In 2020, amid renewed national attention during a summer of protest, the sheriff asked the State Bureau of Investigation to take a fresh look, and an online petition gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures demanding answers. But in 2021, the state concluded its review, and the district attorney declined to bring any charges, again calling it a tragic accident. For a family convinced that the first investigation had been compromised, the second look brought no comfort and no closure. Where does it stand now? As of 2026, the case remains closed and officially classified as an accident, with no charges and no federal investigation, despite continued calls for one. A defamation lawsuit brought by several party guests against a friend of Horsford's, who had publicly questioned the ruling, was later dismissed. The case drew the attention of national figures and celebrities, who amplified the family's call for answers. And the family's attorney has said plainly that he believes it was a homicide, but simply cannot prove who was responsible. For Tamla Horsford's 5 children, the official word is accident, while the questions about that night, about the unexplained injuries, the conflicts of interest, and the only black woman in the house have never gone away. Tamla Horsford's case is a question of justice that may never come. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next is a question of identity itself. A woman found burned in a frozen valley, who carried a dozen names and belonged to none of them. The Isdal woman. In November of 1970, a man and his 2 young daughters, hiking in a frozen valley outside Bergen, Norway, found the badly burned body of a woman lying among the rocks. More than 50 years later, no one knows who she was, and her case remains one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in Europe. Around the body lay charred clothing, melted bottles, an umbrella, jewelry, a half-empty bottle of Kloster liqueur, and sleeping pills. And crucially, every manufacturing label had been cut from her clothing and scratched off her belongings. Even the labels on the bottles had been removed. Someone, possibly the woman herself, had taken great care to ensure she could not be traced. The position of the body, in the so-called pugilistic attitude common to fire victims, and the items around her gave the scene the appearance of a deliberate, almost staged, end. What did investigators find next? 2 suitcases recovered from lockers at the Bergen railway station contained 8 false passports under different aliases, along with wigs, multiple sets of clothing, and currencies from several countries. A coded notebook recorded her travels through European cities, which investigators were eventually able to decipher as dates and the initials of places she had visited. Witnesses recalled a woman who had stayed at hotels across Norway under various names, spoke poor English, but was heard speaking German and what some thought was Flemish, had distinctive gold dental work uncommon in Scandinavia, and was sometimes seen with an unidentified dark-haired man. She had changed hotels frequently and requested room changes, behaving, witnesses felt, like someone who did not want to be found. How did she lose her life? The autopsy found she had taken a large quantity of sleeping pills and had also inhaled smoke, since her lungs contained soot, indicating she was alive when the fire began. In 1970, Bergen police ruled the case most likely self-inflicted, though that conclusion was disputed at the time, with a leading crime reporter stating flatly that he was convinced it had been a homicide. The careful removal of every identifying label sat very uneasily with the official theory. Why did the espionage theories take hold? Because of the Cold War setting, Bergen lay near NATO naval installations and a secret missile testing program, and a multilingual woman traveling under 8 aliases in that place and time looked to many like a spy who had been silenced. No espionage link has ever been proven, but the theory has never gone away either. What has modern science revealed? In a major reinvestigation around 2016 and 17, Norwegian and British broadcasters worked with police to apply modern forensic methods to her remains, which had been preserved since the original autopsy. Isotope analysis of her teeth concluded she was born around 1930, likely near Nuremberg, Germany, and had moved as a child to the French-German border region, while DNA analysis pointed to maternal ancestry from southeastern Europe or southwestern Asia. For the first time, a rough outline of a real life began to emerge from the aliases. Did the new leads identify her? No. A podcast on the reinvestigation generated more than 150 tips, and genetic genealogy specialists offered to help. But none of it has produced a name. A 2023 lead in a Swiss newspaper speculated about a possible connection to a Nazi-aligned banker. But it remains unverified. Where does it stand now? As of 2026, the Isdal woman has still not been identified, and the case remains officially open at the Bergen Police District. Investigators now have a probable birth year, a probable birthplace near Nuremberg, and a partial map of her ancestry. But not the one thing that matters most. Her name. The genetic genealogy effort that has cracked so many other cold cases has so far found no relatives to anchor her to. Whoever she was, whatever she was doing moving through Norway under 8 false identities, and whoever scratched the labels from her possessions, she remains, half a century on, a woman known only by the frozen valley where 3 hikers found her. The Isdal woman left a body, but no identity. The next case left 3 identities, but for years, no bodies at all. An entire family that simply vanished. The murder of the Jameson family. When hunters found the Jamesons' locked white pickup on a remote Oklahoma track in October of 2009, everything was inside. The parents' wallets and phones, $32,000 in cash in a bag beneath the seat, and the family dog, starving but alive after 8 days. Bobby, Sherilyn, and their young daughter were gone, and it would be 4 years before anyone learned what had become of them. Bobby Jameson, 44, his wife Sherilyn, 40, and their daughter lived in Eufaula, Oklahoma, and had been planning to buy a remote 40-acre plot in the Sans Bois Mountains, where they intended to live in a storage container. Bobby was on disability after a car accident, and Sherilyn had been hospitalized shortly before following a mental health crisis. On the 8th of October, the family was last seen driving toward the property. A man living nearby reported seeing them look at the land for about 15 minutes before they drove a short distance away and were never seen alive again. 8 days later, hunters came upon the truck. What did the security footage show? Cameras at their home captured Bobby and Sherilyn loading the truck in what investigators described as a trance-like state, making roughly 20 trips, sometimes carrying nothing, sometimes standing motionless with vacant stares. It is footage that has unsettled everyone who has seen it. A man living near the land later said he watched them look at the property for about 15 minutes, then drive off, never to be seen alive again. What was found in the truck? Along with the cash, phones, and IDs, were maps, a GPS unit, and a handwritten letter from Sherilyn angrily addressed to Bobby. A brown briefcase seen in the security footage, loaded into the truck by Sherilyn, was missing when the vehicle was found. The $32,000 left untouched ruled out any obvious robbery, and the malnourished dog locked inside suggested the family had not planned to be gone. Why a family that had loaded a truck and driven to remote land would simply walk away from all of it, leaving behind cash, phones, and their dog, has never been explained. How strange did the context get? Bobby had told his pastor the family was seeing spirits and asked whether there were special bullets to use against them. A so-called witch's Bible was found in the home, and Sherilyn had spray-painted a cryptic message about cats being harmed by people in the area onto the storage container. Bobby was also in bitter litigation with his own father, said by some to have ties to the local drug trade, and reportedly had a restraining order against him. The family had also evicted a roommate with extremist connections, and Sherilyn's name was said to have appeared on a list of targets. A photograph of their daughter was found on Bobby's phone, possibly taken the day before they vanished. Theories multiplied in every direction. When were they found? In November of 2013, deer hunters discovered the skeletal remains of 2 adults and a child lying side by side, face down, on a mountain about 2.5 miles from the abandoned truck. The medical examiner positively identified them as the Jamesons in 2014. But because of severe decomposition and animal activity, the cause could not be determined. There was no obvious trauma the bones could still reveal, no weapon, no scene preserved, nothing to confirm even whether all 3 had been harmed by another person. Where does it stand now? The case remains unsolved and officially open with the Latimer County Sheriff's Office. Theories range from a drug deal gone wrong to foul play by Bobby's estranged father, to the family being eliminated after witnessing something illegal, to the wilder possibilities suggested by the occult items in their home. A former sheriff has said he believes they were forced to stop and got out of the truck to meet someone they recognized. No one has ever been arrested or charged. The cash, the starving dog, the trance-like footage, and the bodies on the mountain remain a set of facts that no single theory has ever fully explained. The Jamesons disappeared in a single afternoon. The next victim was terrorized for nearly 7 years before her case ended in a verdict that satisfied no one. The murder of Cindy James. Over nearly 7 years, a Canadian nurse reported around 90 terrifying incidents. Threatening phone calls, slashed pillows, obscene messages scrawled on her walls, lifeless animals left in her yard, and several physical assaults on her person. Then, in 1989, she vanished and was found hogtied in the yard of an abandoned house. Her case ended in one of the strangest verdicts in Canadian legal history. Cindy James was a respected pediatric nurse in Richmond, British Columbia, who coordinated care at a facility for children with behavioral disorders, and who in 1982 separated from her husband, a psychiatrist many years her senior. Beginning that year, she reported a relentless campaign of harassment to the police, some callers reportedly growling threats of harm. The timing, beginning so soon after the separation, would later feed competing theories about who, if anyone, was tormenting her. The incidents escalated alarmingly over the years that followed. How serious did it get? She was found on more than one occasion injured or unconscious, including once in her garage with a stocking around her neck, once near her home unconscious, and once hypothermic in a ditch miles away, wearing a man's work boot and glove. She moved house, changed her name, and hired a private investigator, while the RCMP devoted enormous resources to the case. Despite thousands of hours of surveillance and an estimated $1.5 million spent, no suspect was ever identified, and no surveillance ever captured an attacker. Was she causing it herself? That became the central question. Arson investigators found that a fire she reported as a deliberate act had been set with the glass falling outward, consistent with self-staging, and the RCMP increasingly suspected she was behind at least some of the incidents. Her family and her private investigator rejected that theory completely, insisting she was a genuine victim being stalked by someone real. What happened in 1989? In May, James disappeared. Her car was found in a shopping mall parking lot with blood on the door, her groceries spilled, and her credit card lying underneath. 2 weeks later, on the 8th of June, her body was found in the yard of an abandoned house, her hands and feet bound behind her back, and a black stocking knotted around her neck. Toxicology revealed a lethal quantity of morphine and sedatives she had no prescriptions for. Yet no syringe was found at the scene, and she had no defensive injuries. How could she have bound herself that way? That was the impossible heart of the case. It was difficult to see how she could have hogtied her own hands and feet behind her back and administered a fatal dose with no syringe present. Yet equally hard to square the years of apparent self-staging with a genuine outside attacker. Both explanations required believing something nearly impossible. What did the inquest decide? A 40-day coroner's inquest in 1990, among the longest in the province's history, heard from more than 80 witnesses, including not specialists, psychiatrists, forensic experts, and her family. And the jury returned an open verdict. An end by unknown event, neither homicide, self-inflicted, nor accidental. The not experts testified about whether she could plausibly have bound herself, and no firm answer emerged. It was a formal acknowledgement that the truth could not be established to any legal standard. Where does it stand now? As of 2026, the case remains officially closed, with the RCMP holding to its staged conclusion and the family maintaining she was a victim, and no new evidence has emerged to break the deadlock. It became the subject of 2 books published in 1991, a network television program, and decades later, a multi-part podcast that revisited every detail of the 7-year ordeal. More than 3 decades later, no one can say with certainty whether Cindy James was hunted to her end by a phantom stalker no surveillance ever caught, or was herself the architect of her own terrifying undoing. Cindy James's case ended in a verdict of unknown event. The next case was caught, in part, on a surveillance video the entire world would come to study, frame by frame. The murder of Elisa Lam. In February of 2013, Los Angeles police released roughly 2.5 minutes of elevator footage showing a young woman pressing every button, peering into the hallway, hiding, and making strange gestures. Within days, the world was watching, and days after that, her body was found in a rooftop water tank above the hotel where she had been staying. Elisa Lam was a 21-year-old Canadian university student from Vancouver who had bipolar disorder and a documented history of stopping her medication and experiencing episodes. Traveling alone, she checked into the historic and notorious Cecil Hotel near downtown Los Angeles in late January. The Cecil's grim reputation would only feed the speculation to come. What happened at the hotel? Lam reportedly left unsettling notes for her roommates and was moved to a private room, and she was removed from a live audience taping in Burbank for similar behavior. When she failed to check out as scheduled at the end of January, her parents alerted police, and her last confirmed sighting was at a downtown bookstore, where a manager remembered her as friendly and outgoing that day. Nothing in those final sightings suggested where she would be found, or how. Why did the case explode globally? Because of the elevator video, which police released in mid-February in hopes of identifying her movements. It went viral worldwide, accumulating millions of views and tens of thousands of comments within its first 10 days on one video platform alone. People parsed every gesture, convinced the footage showed her reacting to someone or something just out of frame. How was she found? On the 19th of February, after guests complained of low water pressure and discolored, foul-tasting water, a maintenance worker climbed to the roof and found Lam's body in one of the hotel's 4 large rooftop water tanks, with her clothing in the tank beside her. Guests had, by then, been drinking and bathing in that water for days. The discovery was so macabre, and the question of how she had gotten into a covered tank on a roof so hard to answer, that it seemed to confirm, for many, that something sinister had occurred. What did the official investigation conclude? The autopsy was initially inconclusive, and toxicology found prescription medications at low levels, consistent with her not taking them as directed, and no illicit substances or alcohol. In June of 2013, the coroner ruled it an accidental drowning, with bipolar disorder listed as a significant contributing factor. Investigators concluded she had most likely experienced an episode, reached the roof through one of several access points, and entered the tank herself, possibly removing her clothing as a response to hypothermia, then was unable to get out. The tank's lid and the difficulty of access fueled doubt, but no evidence of anyone else was ever found. What harm did the online speculation do? Enormous harm to innocent people. Internet sleuths fixated on theories ranging from the supernatural to outright homicide. And a musician who had stayed at the hotel a year earlier was falsely accused and harassed so severely that he later spoke of being deeply scarred by the experience. A widely shared coincidence that a tuberculosis test in use near the hotel shared letters with her name was just that, a coincidence. But it fed the conspiracy theories for years. The Cecil's own grim history, having housed several notorious figures over the decades, only made people more eager to believe the hotel itself was somehow to blame. Where does it stand now? A 4-part Netflix series in 2021 re-examined the case and ultimately endorsed the official accident ruling, while documenting the damage done to the people the internet wrongly targeted. The Cecil Hotel was later renovated and reopened as low-income housing. And the official ruling, accidental drowning with bipolar disorder a significant factor, stands with no criminal investigation open. What the world treated as an unsolvable mystery was, in the end, most likely the tragedy of a young woman in crisis, with no villain at all except the illness she could not outrun. Elisa Lam's case was ruled an accident. The last case was unmistakably a homicide, and yet, decades on, it makes no more sense than any case that was never explained. The Blair Adams case. In the last week of his life, a Canadian construction foreman emptied his savings, told his family that people were trying to harm him, and fled across an entire continent in a panic no one understood. He ended up lifeless in a Tennessee parking lot, thousands of miles from home, and nearly 30 years later, no one knows why he was there or who took his life. Blair Adams was a 31-year-old construction foreman from Surrey, British Columbia, who worked for his stepfather's company and was 2 years sober. In the weeks before his end, he began suffering mood swings and telling those close to him that people were trying to harm him, though he had no psychiatric diagnosis and would not explain what he was afraid of. His mother later recalled that he hinted at some secret he could not bring himself to share. What did his final week look like? It was a frantic, illogical journey. He withdrew nearly all his savings and emptied his safe deposit box of more than $6,000 in cash, jewelry, and gold and platinum bars, then tried and failed to enter the United States by ferry, turned back by immigration officials who felt he fit a drug courier profile. He quit his job, bought a one-way ticket to Germany, where he had recently been involved with a woman, then refunded it. He eventually crossed into Washington state on foot after a second border stop, flew to Washington, D.C., rented a car, and drove all the way to Knoxville, Tennessee, a city he had no known connection to. What happened in Knoxville? On the evening of the 10th of July, he locked himself out of his rental car at a gas station, insisting to the tow truck driver that he had the right key when he did not, and was dropped at a hotel. Surveillance there captured him entering and exiting the lobby 5 times in about 40 minutes, paying $100 cash for a room he never entered. The next morning, construction workers at a site across the interstate interchange found his body in the parking lot. 2 witnesses later reported having seen him with an unknown man outside a nearby restaurant that evening. What did the autopsy reveal? The cause was sepsis from an abdominal injury following a heavy blow to the stomach, and he had a forehead wound consistent with a crowbar or club, defensive wounds on his hands, and bruising consistent with being struck by a vehicle. The autopsy also noted possible indications of a sexual element, though nothing could be confirmed. This was plainly a homicide, not an accident or a self-inflicted end. What ruled out robbery? The fact that nothing was taken. He still had around $4,000 in mixed Canadian, American, and German currency, his passport, and a pouch containing roughly 5 ounces of gold and platinum bars and coins. None of it touched, which eliminated theft as a motive. The only piece of forensic evidence was a single strand of hair clutched in his hand, which did not belong to him. For a man carrying a small fortune to be left with all of it in a public parking lot told investigators that whatever had happened was not about money. Where does it stand now? The case remains unsolved. A DNA profile developed from that strand of hair has never matched anyone in any database, and a composite sketch of the man 2 witnesses saw with Adams that evening was never identified. There is no established connection between Adams and Knoxville. His mother once speculated he might have been heading toward the Atlanta Olympics that summer, but no evidence supports it. And theories range from an encounter that turned fatal to something tied to whatever he had been so afraid of. A cold case investigator has spoken of the frustration of reaching one impasse after another, and the Knox County Sheriff's Office still lists it as open. A man fled across a continent convinced someone was coming for him. And in the end, someone was, leaving behind a fortune in untouched valuables, a single strand of hair, and a terror he never explained to anyone. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.